The curious case of Anthony Johnson offers a fascinating glimpse into a little-known but crucial figure in American history. Anthony Johnson, an African man who arrived in the early English colonies, defies the simplistic narratives often associated with the early history of race and slavery in America. His life and the legal battles he engaged in challenge our understanding of the dynamics of race, slavery, and class in the 17th century. Anthony Johnson was not born in the colonies. His story begins in Angola, where he was likely captured during one of the many Portuguese incursions into the African interior during the early 17th century. He was then transported across the Atlantic as part of the brutal transatlantic slave trade. Arriving in Virginia around 1621, Johnson was sold into servitude, a fate shared by many Africans brought to the New World at the time. In 1621, the English colony of Virginia was still in its infancy. Life was harsh, and the demand for labor was insatiable. English colonists relied heavily on indentured servants to cultivate tobacco, the cash crop that promised to make Virginia profitable. These indentured servants included not only Africans but also poor Europeans, who agreed to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World, food, and shelter. Anthony Johnson's status as an indentured servant in Virginia was not unique. At this time, the English legal system did not yet have a fully developed concept of racialized slavery. Africans, like Johnson, were often treated as indentured servants rather than slaves for life. They were expected to work for a certain number of years, after which they could earn their freedom and, in some cases, land. By the mid-17th century, Anthony Johnson had achieved something remarkable for an African in the English colonies. He gained his freedom and became a landowner. 1651, Johnson had amassed a sizable estate on Virginia's eastern shore, where he and his family farmed tobacco. This was a significant achievement in a society where most Africans were still laboring under the conditions of servitude or slavery. However, Anthony Johnson's story is most intriguing for what happened in 1655, when he became involved in a legal case that would have lasting implications for the institution of slavery in America. The case, known as Johnson v. Parker, arose when Johnson claimed ownership of a black servant named John Kaiser, who had been working on his estate. Kaiser argued that he was an indentured servant whose term of service had expired, and he sought his freedom. Johnson, however, claimed that Kaiser was his servant for life, a legal status that effectively made him a slave. This case is particularly curious because it challenges the notion that all Africans in early America were victims of a strictly racialized system of slavery. Anthony Johnson, a former African servant himself, argued in court for the right to own another black man as a servant for life. The Virginia court ruled in Johnson's favor, making John Kaiser the first person in the English colonies to be declared a slave for life through a civil case. This ruling is significant because it illustrates how the legal system in the colonies was beginning to shift towards a more rigid and racialized form of slavery. The Johnson v. Parker case was not just a personal victory for Anthony Johnson, it was a landmark moment in the legal history of slavery in America. It set a precedent for the institutionalization of slavery as a lifelong condition tied to race, a precedent that would have devastating consequences for millions of Africans and their descendants in the centuries to come. Despite his success, Anthony Johnson's life in Virginia did not end on a high note. In the later years of his life, the increasingly racialized laws and social norms of Virginia began to work against him and his family. After Johnson's death in 1670, a court ruled that because he was a black people, his land could be seized by the state rather than inherited by his children. This ruling reflects the growing entrenchment of racial distinctions in colonial law, which increasingly viewed Africans and their descendants as property rather than people. The case of Anthony Johnson is curious not only because of the contradictions it exposes, but also because of what it reveals about the early stages of American slavery. Johnson's life highlights the fluidity of racial and social identities in the early English colonies, where the lines between indentured servitude and slavery were not yet clearly defined. His story also underscores the role of legal institutions in solidifying the racial hierarchies that would come to define American society. Johnson's life raises important questions about the nature of freedom, property, and race in the early American colony. How could an African man gain his freedom and become a successful landowner in a society that would soon develop into one of the most rigidly racialized systems of slavery in the world? How did the legal system in Virginia evolve to accommodate and eventually enforce the institution of slavery? And what does Johnson's story tell us about the complexities of race and power in early American history? To answer these questions, it is essential to understand the broader context in which Anthony Johnson lived. The 17th century was a period of intense change and uncertainty in the English colonies. The economy was expanding rapidly, driven by the labor-intensive cultivation of tobacco, and the demand for labor was insatiable. unsustainable. The English colonists initially relied on a mix of indentured servants from Europe and Africa to meet this demand, but as the century progressed, the legal and social distinctions between European and African laborers became more pronounced. In the early years of the Virginia colony, Africans were not necessarily seen as racially distinct from Europeans in terms of their legal status. Many Africans, like Anthony Johnson, were treated as indentured servants who could eventually earn their freedom. However, as the demand for labor grew and the supply of European indentured servants dwindled, the colonists began to shift towards a system of racialized slavery. This shift was driven by economic factors, as well as by the colonists' increasing fear of a growing free black population that could challenge the social order. The legal case of Johnson v. Parker is a key moment in this shift. By arguing for his right to own John Kaiser as a servant for life, Anthony Johnson was participating in the legal construction of a system that would soon become one of the most brutal and dehumanizing institutions in American history. The fact that Johnson himself was African complicates the story and challenges our understanding of how race and slavery were constructed in the early colonies. It is important to note that Anthony Johnson was not the only African to achieve freedom and success in the early colonies. There were other free black landowners in Virginia and elsewhere, and some of them, like Johnson, owned servants or slaves. However, Johnson's case is particularly notable because it occurred at a time when the legal distinctions between indentured servitude and slavery were still being defined. His success and eventual downfall illustrate the tenuous position of free blacks in a society that was rapidly moving towards a system of racialized slavery. The life of Anthony Johnson forces us to confront the complexities and contradictions of early American history. It challenges the simplistic narratives of slavery and race that often dominate our understanding of this period. Johnson's story is a reminder that the history of race in America is not a straightforward tale of black versus white or slave versus free. It is a story of fluid identities, shifting legal categories, and the constant negotiation of power and status in a rapidly changing society. In many ways, Anthony Johnson's story is a microcosm of the broader history of race and slavery in America. It reveals the ways in which race was constructed and contested in the early colonies, and shows how legal institutions played a crucial role in the creation of a racialized system of slavery. Johnson's life also highlights the agency of Africans in the early colonies, who were not merely passive victims of a brutal system, but active participants in shaping their own destinies, even within the confines of a deeply oppressive society. The curious case of Anthony Johnson is a story that deserves to be better known. It challenges us to think more deeply about the origins of race and slavery in America, and to reconsider the assumptions we often make about this period. By examining the life of Anthony Johnson, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of early American history, and the ways in which race, law, and power intersected to shape the society we live in today. As we reflect on Anthony Johnson's life, we are reminded of the importance of historical context in understanding the past. Johnson's story is not just about one man's journey from servitude to freedom and back again. It is about the broader forces that were at work in the 17th century English colonies. It is about the ways in which economic, legal, and social factors combined to create a system of racialized slavery that would have profound consequences for the future of America. In conclusion, the life of Anthony Johnson is a curious and complex chapter in American history. It challenges our understanding of race and slavery in the early colonies, and offers valuable insights into the legal and social dynamics of the time. By exploring the case of Anthony Johnson, we can gain a deeper understanding of the origins of racialized slavery in America, and the ways in which individuals like Johnson navigated the complexities of this emerging system. His story is a powerful reminder of the importance of historical context, and the need to look beyond simplistic narratives to understand the true complexity of the past. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.